Welcome everyone and good afternoon. I'm Michelle McAdams. I'm the University Relationship Manager and Members Editor for the Conversation US. Thank you so much for attending today. I'm delighted to have been invited by Boston University's Marketing and Communications Department and BU's Office of Research to run today's workshop. And I want to welcome BU faculty, staff, and researchers from across its campuses. Today's event is part of BU's Strategic Communication Series, which helps members of the BU community communicate their research and expertise in effective, compelling, and accessible ways. I have a couple of quick announcements before we jump right into the presentation. We are recording today's session, as you may have noticed. We'll be sharing the recording as well as my slides after the presentation in case either are helpful for anyone to have on hand. So you will have access to those for reference later. We'll also have some time for questions at the end of the presentation, but you're also more than welcome at any point during the presentation to either unmute yourself and ask a question or to put your question in the chat. I'm happy to answer questions as we go along. So here's just a very quick rundown of today's agenda. We will talk a bit about knowing your audience when you're writing for the general public. We'll also talk about how to connect with the public. We will talk a bit about the Conversation US, where I work, and our unique model of journalism. We'll talk about what we at the Conversation look for specifically in a pitch. We'll go over a few examples of pitches we've received, both strong pitches and weaker ones, and why. And then, as I mentioned, we will open it up to questions. So journalists may seem like an alien species, and it's true that we work in very different ways from academic researchers. As you can see here on the slide, we often have very different expectations in terms of timelines. But I think both groups can agree that clear, timely, and accurate information is extremely valuable. Scholars and journalists both bring important things to the table. Scholars have deep subject expertise and experience, and journalists know how to shape a story about it. Good coverage really requires both. To share your research with the public, it's important to understand how it will be different than from talking to scholars and your peers. As you know, scholars tend to communicate with peers through these listed channels: journal articles, academic monographs and books, conference presentations and poster sessions, and informal channels like blogs, social media, and other websites. Some key features of these channels are that everyone in the group shares a common knowledge base. Members can also pretty much presume that others are interested in what they have to say and how it builds on their previous work, and language is often very specialized. However, it's important to note that most Americans get their knowledge about current issues from one or more news media outlets. This includes local and national, online and print publications, as well as TV news and public radio. People, as you know, also get their news from social media and from news aggregators like Apple News, Yahoo News, and some others. These reports are very different from scholarly channels in some key ways, as you might imagine. They feature shorter, less detailed reports. They use simpler language. For example, New York Times articles are edited to a 10th grade reading level, which might surprise some folks. Also, stories provide context and they don't assume prior knowledge of a topic or subject area. Unlike writing or talking to other scholars, you can't assume that members of the public know much about your topic or perceive it as relevant to them in their lives. So if you want to meet the general public and if you want to reach them, you need to give them a reason to be interested. Often that means showing them how an issue affects them or people they care about, but it can also mean debunking a myth or drawing attention to something that's just cool, interesting, or utterly surprising. To get a sense of news interest or value for a general reader, you might consider trying your story idea out on a colleague, ideally someone who's not in your field, just to get their thoughts and see their reactions. When you talk to them about your idea, what about your idea resonates with them? What questions do they have? Knowing this can help as you later begin to think about and craft your pitch. So what is a pitch exactly? I'm sure everyone's either heard the term or knows a little bit about what it is, but a pitch defined really is a brief description of a story intended to convince an editor, producer, or publisher to commission that piece, to commission that story. Writer and educator Lee Schulman explains it a bit more in a bit more detail. She says a pitch is an email you write to an editor explaining a story idea that you feel is perfect for their publication in hopes that they'll agree and commission you to write the piece. It's not just any email though. You want to craft a concise description and explain why you're the best person to write the piece, and do this in about 500 words or less, which is a tall order. It's a shorthand version of your story that allows an editor to understand what the story is about, what will go into it, and why they should commission you to write it. We'll talk a little bit later about our specific pitch process in the conversation and what we're looking for in a pitch. But for now, I'll just be speaking a little bit generally about general news media outlets. As I mentioned before, to communicate effectively, you need to meet people where they are. And so the first question is always to ask who you're talking to. Your audience will really influence which outlet you use and how you convey your message. Every news media outlet, whether it works in print, online, or broadcast, has their own target audience. So if you're pitching an article or doing an interview with a particular outlet, you want to learn as much as you can about their audience ahead of time, and then think about what those folks are likely to know, what they're likely not to know, and how you can meet them where they are. So a good first question is, who exactly is the general public? Who are we writing for? As you can imagine, the general public is not one unified mass. It's made up of many different audiences, which could include the attentive public. These are folks who consume news on a regular basis. It could include members of your local community, specialists in your own or related area, a set of people who are affected by an issue, which could be defined by a number of things such as geography or factors such as age, race, ethnicity, religion, or other belief system. It could include policymakers. It could also include funders and others. To meet people where they are, it's really helpful to think about what in particular about your research is going to be relevant to them and their lives, and then to condense your information to focus on those key points. You also want to avoid specialized terms that someone outside of your field isn't likely to know. Jargon, acronyms, and unfamiliar language tell your audience this isn't for you and can often drive readers away. Also, be willing to trade off some detail and specificity in return for reaching a broader audience. It's really important to note that this is not a dumbing down of your ideas or your views, it's democratizing knowledge. The ideas that you present can be quite complex, it's just your language that needs to be simple and accessible. As one very famous doctor recently said, the goal is to get people to understand what you're talking about. It's also important as you begin to think about what you hope to achieve by sharing your scholarship with the public. There's lots of different goals, lots of different reasons for communicating your research with others outside of academia. Educating this man here in the supermarket photo on the left about chemical residue on food will, for example, require a very different message in a different outlet than getting state legislators to hold hearings on the same issue. So you want to think about what you hope to do in an ideal world. Do you want to spark readers' curiosity with an interesting science story? Do you want to add context to something that's already being discussed in the news? Help the public make informed decisions? Advocate for a position or an action, or propose something to legislators, or perhaps a combination of some or all of these things? These are just important factors to consider and reflect on before you start working on your pitch. No matter what your goal or message is, when it comes to writing for the public, you don't want to bury the lead, which you may have heard before. Burying the lead means saving the newsworthy part of your story for the very end. Instead, you want to actually start with the news. On the left here, you'll see this typical approach to a scholarly paper where you start with all of the background information, then maybe move on to methods and other supporting details, and then finally come to a conclusion and end with the findings. For journalistic stories, you really want to invert this structure and use the triangle here on the right side which means starting right off the bat with the key point and then unpacking the details from there. You don't want to save your big takeaway for the very end. General interest audiences have a lot of demands on their time and a lot of distractions. And if it's not clear what your story is going to tell them from the very beginning, they'll often stop reading and move on to something else. So a big takeaway to remember is just it's helpful to think about these two triangles. The structure on the right is really what news outlets are looking for and what we're looking for at the conversation when you pitch to us. It's important to keep things in perspective. Pitching, is a very challenging process. Rejection, unfortunately, is part of the process, and it can be hard to boil down what you want to say at first for a general audience, but it does get much easier with practice. You can't control some factors like the news cycle, what the outlet already has in the works, internal policies that affect commissioning decisions and things like that. But you can control some things like the research you do ahead of time and your actual pitch. You all too also have a huge resource in your BU PR team who is able to work with you, whether it's preparing for a radio interview or a print interview or helping you work on a pitch for us or another media outlet. You don't, as I mentioned, want to give an editor or a reader reasons to turn down your story, an editor reasons to turn down your story, or a reader reasons to stop reading. So here are some things to keep in mind that you can control during the process. As I mentioned earlier, you always want to remember and start with your audience and start with the news. You also want to avoid jargon, which can obscure meaning and demonstrate to general readers that something isn't written for them. Also, don't euphemize. You want to say things clearly and simply. And part of this also is being careful not to turn nouns into verbs. Ben Franklin said in a letter to Noah Webster that denominalization or verbing is awkward and abominable. I think that's a little harsh, but it does read as another form of jargon and can turn some readers away. Also, you always want to do your homework before you submit your pitch by looking at what the outlet, where you want to publish has run, looking to see if it's run something similar already. If you do find something that's very similar to the topic you're seeking to propose, you should probably hold off on pitching it for another time. If it's somewhat similar, but you stake out some new territory or you have new insight or findings to share, then just say that in your pitch. You don't want to pitch a story that's just like one the outlet published yesterday. Also, you might consider staggering your pitches rather than pitching to multiple outlets simultaneously. Some outlets don't mind if you do submit simultaneously, but people can sort of get in trouble sometimes doing that and possibly slip up and send Scientific American an email that opens with "Dear Atlantic Editor." So one way to kind of avoid that completely is just to stagger your pitches, keep track of them, in a notebook or Excel spreadsheet, and kind of tick them off your list as you hear back from editors. Also, you've probably all heard the idiom "show, don't tell." That means you should really avoid writing simply that a policy, for example, is discriminatory, and instead show what the discrimination looks like and its after effects. If you're writing about the living conditions in a refugee camp, for example, don't just tell us that they're terrible. Show us the brown water that comes out of the taps and the rubble where children are playing. Details like these really capture readers' attention, bring a story and a subject to life, and can keep readers' attention throughout the piece. And lastly, here's a bonus one specific to the conversation. You want to give readers the benefit of the facts that you have access to, but not tell people what to think. You want to tell them what you know and what you can conclude from it. So at the conversation, we really ask authors and people pitching to emphasize facts, figures, and scholarship, because what we publish are not opinion pieces, but explanatory ones that we call news analysis. So really emphasizing the facts, figures, and scholarships goes a long way in a pitch and goes a long way in a written piece for us. So I'm going to stop there for a moment and see if there are any questions before we shift gears a little bit and talk about the conversation specifically. Does anyone have any questions?
I just wanted to ask what TCUS means.
Oh, sure. I'm so sorry. It's the Conversation US, which we shortened to TCUS. And I should have mentioned that right off the bat. Thank you for the question. Does anyone else have a question?
Hi, I have a question about staggering your pitches. I've heard before that it's not always like if you pitch something or like you kind of write personally and put it on your own website, like could that count towards a pitch or being published elsewhere beforehand?
That's a really good question. And it's hard to answer because it's outlet specific. So I know for the conversation, we do consider something that's posted on a personal blog, something that's posted anywhere on the internet that is considered published, even if it's a smaller or more personal audience. I don't know though that is sort of the way most or all publications work. Usually for most publications, and we have this, you can see a link to it at the very bottom of our homepage. Usually there's some kind of contributor, or submission guidelines and specifics about like what's considered published and what's not will be laid out in those guidelines. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Are there any other questions?
Michelle, we have one more question. Someone asked, can you give an example of turning nouns into verbs?
Sure. I think I have one of my colleagues, Naomi, the politics and society editor. She always has a whole grab bag of these. I think she says one she really dislikes is fast tracking something to success or fast tracking something ahead, which seems more common. I feel like we hear that all the time, but it is an example of verbing. I'll try to think of some others if I can, but basically it's anything where you kind of take a noun and one actually I hear a lot, and that I apologize if anyone's a fan of this. It always kind of irks me when I hear it, is to language something. I've been hearing that more and more instead of just saying to tell or to share or to convey. I've been hearing more. I guess it's like in the zeitgeist of languaging something, putting something to language, which it's sort of always easier to just use the more basic verb. I hope that answers the question. Great. Molly, were there any other questions in the chat?
Yep, we have a couple more, and then we can save anyone else who writes in for the end.
Sure.
One person asked, can you speak briefly about the line between writing precisely and using jargon? That's
a really, really good question. So I think what it has to do with is thinking back to your audience. So if specificity in terms of detail is really important, and it's one of the ways that we demonstrate to readers that something is resonant to them, that something affects them, affects their loved ones, affects their daily lives. So specifics in terms of the research and the findings are very important, but when you're thinking about how to convey that to a general audience, the language you use really needs to be simple and needs to meet people where they are. If the language you're using, if you're not sure if something's jargon and whether or not to include it in a pitch or in a story, if the language you're using requires some background knowledge of the subject area in order to be able to understand it, it's most likely jargon, and general readers would be better served by a more lay-friendly description or phrase, if that makes sense.
Great, thanks for sharing your answer. Someone asked if we're going to discuss how to craft a pitch, which I know you are getting to later in your presentation. And the last question is, how can you write a simple article for a person and reference another person's work in an informal manner within that article, opposed to the APA format?
Would you mind repeating that again, Molly? So is it sort of like a question of pitching a story that would further someone's argument, or I'm just not quite clear on the question.
I think, and feel free to chime in who asked, but I think what they're asking is how do you reference someone else's work within your piece in a pretty informal manner without a citation?
Oh, so specifically, I'm not, other publications do it in a number of ways, and we can get into this. Thank you, Molly. We can get into this a little bit more in the coming slides. The way we do it is we link to original scholarly articles and evidence throughout the text of all of our stories. So pretty much every line, every other line, anything that's asserting a particular statement or argument or piece of information has to be backed in the evidence. So throughout the stories, if you have time to look on our site, you'll see that everything goes back to the original source. We do that through URL links, for the most part DOI links, since those are the most static and stable, but we also link to other kinds of sources too. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks so much, Michelle. That's all the questions we have.
Thanks, Molly. All right, so shifting gears a little bit and talking specifically about the publication where I work. Here at The Conversation, our mission is to promote truthful information and strengthen journalism by sharing the rich diversity of academic research for audiences across America. Or a little bit more succinctly put, we seek to democratize knowledge for the public good. We're a nonprofit independent publisher of expert research and news analysis. We were founded in Australia in 2011, and we're part of a global network of sister sites in 9 different countries, including the UK, Canada, Africa, France, Spain, Indonesia, and New Zealand. TCUS, or The Conversation US, is based in the Boston area and was launched in 2014. Our first office was actually in the basement of BU's College of Communication building, and BU was one of our founding partner schools. All of our stories are written by faculty and researchers at US colleges and universities and edited by our team of veteran journalists for the general public. We publish only original pieces that have not been published elsewhere. Scholars write explanatory journalism pieces within their specific area of expertise for a variety of our desks, from arts and culture, education and politics and society, to science and tech, health and medicine, economy and business, and more. Our editors work really closely with scholars in a collaborative process to ensure that all stories are accessible, informative, and of interest to a general reader. We hear from our authors that the process is both rigorous and rewarding. So who are our authors? Our authors must be a current faculty member or researcher at a US college or university. We also allow PhD students to write for us if they're writing on their dissertation topic, or if they want to write a bit more broadly in their field, more broadly than their dissertation topic, but within their field. They can co-author a piece with a PI or a faculty advisor. Master's students can also write about their research for us if they co-author a piece with their faculty advisor. Master's students aren't allowed to, within our model, they're not eligible to write a piece on their own. Because our pieces are explanatory rather than op-eds or advocacy pieces, all authors, as I mentioned earlier, must provide links to research and other evidence throughout their stories to back up all of their statements. These are typically DOI links, like I mentioned, to studies, but can include other types of scholarship research. Occasionally we link to popular news media reports if it's relevant, and referencing prior coverage of something in the news. Authors must fill out a disclosure form that lists their funding sources and any possible conflicts of interest so that our stories can be as transparent to readers as possible. And lastly, we can't publish a story without final approval from the author. Once you've approved your story and it's out in the world, nothing can be changed without your permission, which is often especially reassuring for authors who haven't written with news outlets before to hear. So our readers, by writing one story, scholars can reach audiences in many different publications. Through a Creative Commons license, all of our articles are free to read and free to republish, which means that stories are picked up by outlets ranging from small community and hyperlocal newspapers up to national and international outlets like the Washington Post, CNN, Time, Newsweek, Scientific American, and Univision, and many, many others. We also partner with the Associated Press, which sends all of our stories out over its daily wire, and Yahoo News and Apple News as well. We know how extremely busy faculty and researchers are, and writing is, of course, a big time commitment. So it's often helpful for scholars to know the impact of writing with us before they get started. Our model delivers evidence-based information to millions of people. In 2020 alone, our stories received more than 200 million total reads on our site and through online republishers. Writing with us gives experts a greater voice and impact in shaping scientific, cultural, and intellectual agendas. Based on a 2020 author survey that we conducted and with more than 700 authors, more than 700 author responses. After writing with us, 41% reported receiving a request to be interviewed by a radio outlet, 37% received a request to be interviewed by a print outlet, 27% reported that they saw an increase in citations of their scholarly articles, and 17% reported using their articles or metrics from their articles as part of a grant or new funding opportunity. Lastly, those who work with us, those who write for us, get one-on-one professional development with veteran journalist editors. The kinds of stories that we publish. All of our stories seek to inform and to entertain. Most are about 800 to 1,000 words, but we also publish stories in shorter formats as well, such as research briefs, significant figures, and our newest format, significant terms. But here really are the three main categories of all of our stories: news, commentary, and analysis, new research and discoveries, and what we call just general curiosity pieces. News, commentary, and analysis. These are stories that add context and deeper insight into events and topics that are already being discussed in the news. It could include historical perspectives, analysis, as I mentioned, analysis of events in the news, longer exploratory pieces, geographical comparisons, and what we call idea articles, and much more. New research and discoveries. These are exactly what they sound like. They share new research coming out of academia, including research coming off embargo. And lastly, curiosity pieces. These are pieces that typically answer a simple question that people might be wondering about, or they might give readers a behind the scenes look at how interesting research is being done. It also includes a religious literacy series that teaches readers about religious beliefs and customs. For example, I think in that series, we've run simple explainers answering questions like, what is Eid, or why is Easter called Easter? Curiosity pieces also include our Curious Kids series, in which we ask scholars to answer questions that real kids send to us in a simple and often lighthearted way. So here are some recent headlines from stories by BU professors that fall under that first category: news, commentary, and analysis. Here as well are some examples of research pieces by BU professors, including 2 research briefs edited by BU PR and social media's Leah Plata, who I think might be here with us today and who interned with us this past summer. And lastly, here are some curiosity pieces. This first one is an ethics and religion piece. The second is an explainer that I think was tied to the news that Facebook was changing its name. And lastly, a Curious Kids piece is chewing on ice cubes bad for your teeth, which a dentist very kindly answered for us. At the conversation, we both react to the news with expert analysis, and we try to help set the news agenda with big ideas originating in academia. Our editors consider 4 main things in a pitch, which are laid out here on your screen. Is the story of interest to a general audience? Or why should someone outside of the field and outside of academia care about this story? Is the story timely? Why should they care about this story now? Is the author an expert on what they're pitching, i.e., what research or evidence will the proposed piece be based upon? And lastly, can the angle be covered in 1,000 or fewer words? And what that question is really trying to get at is, what is the one story that the author is proposing to tell? These are just a few examples of things that might seem like a pitch, but are really not considered a pitch for our purposes. A blog post or a story that's already been published, which was mentioned earlier, just a general statement of expertise, a press release or grant announcement, an already written draft of a piece, that's a big one, or a link to a web page with more information. And here are just a few pretty common reasons why pitches are rejected. A pitch might read like an opinion or an advocacy piece, which we don't publish. It might not be intended or written for a general reader, might not be timely, or could have missed, an important milestone or timeline that it was meant to be pegged to. Could be too speculative, not focused enough. Like I mentioned, a full draft sent instead of a pitch, or we might just already have a similar piece in the works. We're going to go over ways to avoid each of these in depth on the next few slides. So you want to convey that your idea is of importance to people outside of your field and outside of academia. So a first question to ask yourself is, how does your story idea and how does your research affect the daily lives of a general reader? Why should it matter to them? You want to make them care. This is called the so what factor in journalism. We mentioned this before, but you want to avoid specialized terms that someone outside your field isn't likely to know. Jargon, acronyms, unfamiliar language, verbing, those are things that, as we mentioned, can drive readers away. You also want to use short, sharp, and clear language. Again, the ideas that you present can be complex. It's your language that needs to be accessible to the everyday reader. So what about the pitch makes it vital to share now? Is it being talked about in the news, and can you provide deeper insight? Is there an upcoming related anniversary or milestone, and have you given enough lead time to peg a story to that milestone, or have you published new research? These are all things that establish timeliness. As I mentioned earlier, we publish what we call explanatory journalism pieces, not op-eds or opinion or advocacy pieces. Our pieces really seek to emphasize facts, figures, and scholarships over prescriptive statements. So it's really important in your pitches to us to avoid should and must language. Our stories seek to give readers a clear, unbiased, and science-based information so that they can form their own opinion on a given topic or issue. We don't want our pieces to tell people what or how to think. Similarly, our stories are not an opportunity for advocacy. You can make an argument based on facts and research and then draw conclusions from those facts and research in your story. But in the end, you're telling readers what to think about, not what to think. We want our readers to come away from every story with context and information that they need to form their own opinion. Also, since all of our stories are grounded in research, you want to include the scholarship or evidence that the piece will rely upon in your pitch. Sometimes if that's missing, an editor might wonder if the piece is in fact, or the pitch is in fact research-based, or if it's more of an opinion piece or offering something more along the lines of speculation. So be sure to include in your pitch what your findings tell us. And lastly, most of our stories establish the author as an expert on the topic within the first third or so of the piece. So you want to include that relevant expertise information in the pitch as well. As I mentioned before, our stories are about 1,000 words max, and we know that compared to academic articles, this is very, very short. Rather than trying to go for breadth, our stories really seek to offer a deep dive into a particular topic or subject area. So in pitches, it's really important to condense your information and to focus on key points. Usually the thrust of a story can be summed up in one sentence. If you're working on your pitch and yours really can't be summed up yet, keep trying to pare it down to its main parts, to its main focus, until you can get to that clear and succinct and sharp statement. So this is our very, very basic pitch form. It's available from our homepage, as well as directly online at theconversation.com/us/pitches. If you haven't registered as an author yet in our system, you'll need to do that first. It's a pretty easy, quick process. You just, and I'm happy to send out the link directly to that. You just need to confirm your account before you'll be able to access this pitch form. It also might be a little bit hard to see here, but these boxes go over or ask for the answers to the questions that we've just gone over. So the first one is your story in 1 or 2 sentences. What's your story with a 50-word limit? The second is significance. Why is it interesting or significant to a general reader? Why is it, the next box is why is this a good time to do the article, and what is your expertise, in the subject. So now in our last few minutes, I'd love to just share some examples of strong pitches and some weaker pitches, and give some examples or give some reasons for why. But before I jump into that, does anyone have any questions?
Michelle, there are a few questions in the chat. Would you like to discuss them now or save them to the end after you walk through the pitches?
We could discuss them now just to be sure we have enough time to get to them. Is that okay?
Great. Yep.
Okay.
So there are 2 similar questions here. One person asked, can you say more about when you pass on something similar to something that's already published? Are you talking verbatim replication? So what about an accessible version of a study also published about in an academic journal that was more laden with jargon? And someone else chimed in asking, can you pitch a story on a research article that you've already published?
Oh, yes. Okay. Those are both great questions. So the first one, I'm specifically talking about the conversation.com. So, or in our story. So for example, if we just ran a story yesterday or last week about wildfires in California, it's not likely that we're going to pick up another story or commission another piece on wildfires in California that soon after, unless your research is offering new insight or is different enough that it's furthering the conversation. We wouldn't publish like a more jargony version of that story in the first place, since we're always writing for general readers. So it's really about sort of taking a look at your proposed topic area, seeing what we've written or what we've published about the area so far, recently. If we publish something, I'd say, a year, 2 years, 3 years ago, I wouldn't worry too much about that. But I'd look at what we've published recently in your general topic area. And if, it's pretty different, it's pretty, your idea is pretty different, pretty unique, then go right ahead. I wouldn't have any qualms at all about pitching it. But if really the angle that you're taking and the particular story idea is pretty similar to something we've run recently, you might want to wait until there's sort of some new insight or finding or angle to share, as opposed to pitching it soon. And then, yes, you're absolutely welcome and encouraged to share research that you've published in academic journals with us. That's not that does not preclude you at all from writing for us. Most of our, or a lot of our stories, all of our stories in that research category are sort of popular or lay-friendly explanations and lay-friendly stories about academic research that has been, your academic research that has been published. So ideally, we like to try to time our story with your research publication. So what we ask scholars to do is when they find out a paper or a study is being accepted, that's really a good time to reach out to us, so that by the time the paper is published, we can ideally time our story with your publication. Since that's, a timeliness factor itself, we can sort of say in new research published in such and such journal, so and so, and so on. However, if it's already been published, that's no problem at all. There's always another news hook or timeliness factor to be able to peg it to. I hope that answered the question.
Thanks, Michelle. Someone also wrote in, it seems like there can be a fine line between a research and opinion piece. Can you offer some insight into how to make sure the former comes through?
Absolutely. I think, and I guess I'll speak specifically to the pitches and here, because when something's commissioned, you're really, for our publication and for other publications too, you're working really collaboratively and closely with an editor, and they kind of have their own suggestions, how to avoid, opinion language. I think the thrust of it though is really like focusing on what the findings tell readers, giving them that information, giving them that news, that scholarship, as opposed to what they should infer from the findings, I guess, if that makes sense. Really keeping it, focused on the scholarship, focused on the evidence and how that affects the daily reader is really like the goal of our stories, as opposed to saying because of this finding, policymakers should do this, or because of this finding, the government should make, social services easier to access, or stuff like that. So it's really honing in and focusing, homing in and focusing on the research, and enlightening readers about what they tell us, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Thanks, Michelle. I think that answered the question. One person, I know you touched on timeliness in one of your previous responses. Someone asked, how long does it take to get from pitch to publication? If an event is unfolding, will you fast track a relevant article?
That is a really great question. It really depends. So I would say we unless something is breaking news, we really let the scholar's schedule and the scholar's timeline dictate, the cycle. So our editors are, working on multiple pieces, during the course of a week. Really, ideally, everything would be sort of, start to finish probably done between a week to 2 weeks, but we have stories that take longer. We have stories that are shorter. We recently started doing a little bit more breaking news coverage. And so those stories really, those are kind of quicker. Often a story will get commissioned at the beginning of the day and either be published by the end of the same day or early the next morning. And that's just because it's pegged to the news and the news is unfolding. So that's definitely something we can do, and we've been doing a lot more of recently. But we also, we know how busy you all are, and respect your time and your schedule. So it might play out over the course of 2, 3, 4 weeks, and that's totally normal and fine too. It does, most of our stories, they're pegged to the news, but the news is often, or a particular topic or subject area is often in the news on an ongoing basis. So there's sort of different opportunities for pegging it to that.
Thanks, Michelle. We have one last question. Someone asked if doctoral students are eligible to write for the conversation.
Sure. Yes, PhD students are absolutely eligible to write for us. You can write on your own, author a piece completely on your own if you're publishing on your particular dissertation topic. So it's a pretty narrow requirement. The other option for PhD students is that you can co-author a piece with either your PI or a faculty mentor or another advisor at your university or perhaps at another university, and write a little bit more broadly within your area of expertise and the co-author's area of expertise, but a little bit more broadly than your dissertation if you prefer to do that. Right, and in our remaining time, I just have a few, we might not get to all of these, but you'll have them for reference in the slides. But I'd love to go over just a couple pitches in our remaining time left. So this is an example of a really strong pitch that came in from for our science and technology desk about UI and UX design tools. So I hope everyone can see this pretty easily and clearly, but the pitch proposes to talk about design tools and their accessibility. So right off the bat, you can see here sort of highlighted in white, the authors, and it came from two co-authors, they ask an interesting question that identifies a problem. So they say right off the bat, how accessible are UI UX design tools? Not very. Then very soon after that, they offer a simple explanation that shows that they can write for lay readers. They say popular design tools aren't currently accessible to people with vision impairments through their screen readers. As accessibility researchers will break down the prototyping tool landscape and discuss ways to improve it. This is really wonderful. In other folks' hands, this could have been a little bit too geared toward a niche audience, or could have included jargon, but these two researchers say right off the bat, we're accessibility researchers, and this is what we propose to do with the possible story. So that convinced our science and tech editor right off the bat that these are people that can write about this clearly for lay readers. They also, under the significance section here, mentioned some really helpful context that our editor might not have known, that general readers might not know, but it's helpful to understanding the story and the problem. And down here, under key points, they mention that inaccessible UI UX prototyping leads to inaccessible design. Making these tools accessible could empower blind technology designers. So they were really ending here with a clear explanation about why this matters and why it matters to people outside of design and accessibility fields. This piece came into our politics, or this pitch, excuse me, came into our politics and society desk. I think it was over the summer. And it's just it also offers a very clear, succinct, and sharp explanation right off the bat about what the story is. So this story explores what happened to the Denver unhoused community through the year 2020 as COVID hit. In this next section, significance, she tells us right away why it matters. So she says the population experiencing homelessness in Denver increased by nearly 15% from 2018 to 2019. This trend, combined with the pandemic, led to a distinct crisis for unhoused communities. So it's very clear what the story is what the story is going to be about, and why it matters. Later, she mentions basically what prior research has been done, but then she talks about the gap and what her particular piece would add to the discussion, would add to the conversation. She says existing literature does not include GIS data of encampments, shelters, services, and geographic movement. This is what her data, this is what her research does include or revolves around, and it shows us basically how she's going to bring unique new research and findings to a potential story. And then she talks a little bit about, having spent the last 7 months on this research. This was a really strong pitch that came into our arts and culture desk about Ansel Adams. And this was, I think, about a year. Yeah, it was back in 2020 that this pitch was sent to us and that the story was published. It right off the bat asked an interesting question about a figure a lot of people will know something about, or at least have heard from. Ansel Adams is famous for his black and white photographs of America's wilderness. His signature style is revered and often imitated. How did he learn that style? It asked a really interesting question. A lot of folks probably won't know the answer to. I didn't know the answer to it. Neither did our arts and culture editor. And so he was intrigued to read on and to eventually commission the piece. Right here in the middle under significance, this shows the surprising finding that's based in this scholar's research. So Adams not only learned from other art undertakings, his experience as a commercial photographer changed the way he approached the medium and allowed him to be more effective in his artwork. This ability to transfer that experience seems widely applicable to how Americans think about their own lives, skills, and careers. So she mentions the surprising finding that her research will tell us. And then she mentions why readers will care, how it's applicable to their lives, how it will resonate with them. And then here under key points, she gives so many, sorry if anyone's hearing my dog in the background. She gives some key points about why she is absolutely the expert to write this story. So she mentions that she's about to publish a book on Ansel Adams that presents this new research. She mentions that she's the chief curator at the Center for Creative Photography at the University of Arizona, and that Adams's archive is there. And then she gives some information in terms of why this is a good time to publish, or when she published it, why it was a good time. So not only is she releasing her book, or was she releasing her book in February 2020, but she mentions the anniversary of his birth, that same month too. So she just sort of thought of everything. This is just one of those sort of wonderful unicorn pitches that we love to see. And here, this is a little bit different. So this came into the Health and Medicine desk last April. It was by a researcher and a scholar, a clinician who's written for us multiple times. And this was around the time that the J&J vaccine was being paused due to side effects. So he very quickly pitched, I think the day before, either the day before or the day the pause was announced, he pitched a very basic explainer exploring the potential side effects of the J&J vaccine for COVID, a blood clot in the veins that drains blood from the brain. So he had a very clear news peg. He sort of anticipated questions that readers would have, the readers especially who had received the J&J vaccine. He says up here, significance, how would I suspect that I have this? He lays out very clearly why it matters. He talks about, people developing severe headaches, abdominal pain, leg pain, shortness of breath, that they should contact their healthcare provider. And then this, isn't always completely necessary, but because this was such a basic and timely explainer that he was proposing, he brings in this other information that's an interesting comparison and that can add context that will add further insight. So he talks a little bit about some of the side effects seen with the use of the AstraZeneca COVID vaccine used in Europe. So that was just telling the author, about his deep expertise on the subject area, but also here's some insight we could, glean from this, similar comparison. And lastly, I think we probably have time for a few more. Lastly, on the strong pitch side, this came in earlier this year on our environment and energy desk. I'll just read part of it really quickly. Llamas have gotten recent press as potentially contributing antibodies for COVID-19, and also for becoming the most popular animal items at toy conventions. What this new media coverage leaves out is the history of how Andean peoples have domesticated, used, and remade the llama over the centuries. So right off the bat here, This author is establishing a really clear news peg for some reason, or for these reasons. Llamas are in the news and are top of mind and of interest to general readers. She mentions this really interesting and surprising idea and a clear explanation of what's missing from the conversation and what her story proposes to do. Later here under significance, she says that recognizing and celebrating the long and intertwined history of llamas and their kin provides insight into the boundaries between wild and domesticated species. So she talks a little bit more about how the story will address what's missing from the conversation and prior coverage elsewhere and add new insight. She also included there were 2 New York Times articles in under a month about llamas, just establishing the news peg. And then here she also establishes her expertise. She's published on the wild llama cousin, the vicuna, and has an animal history project underway on the llama diaspora. Now on to, in our remaining minutes, a few pitches that need work and really why, with the hope that this will, be helpful in terms of understanding what is enough information to include and what happens when pitches are just a little bit too bare for editors to really make a decision on commissioning them. So this pitch came in. It doesn't have a whole lot of information, as you can see, but it asks, is racial equity a conservative or a liberal concern? It's an interesting question. However, it's really broad and really unfocused. And it would make me, as an editor, wonder how would we be able to cover this and do this justice in an 800 to 1,000 word piece. Here, he goes on and says, although conservatives and liberals disagree about racial inequity, they should agree on 5 important truths. There's no details here. He mentions 5 important truths, but doesn't indicate what they are. There's also no indication of if or what research this is based on. And so it comes off reading really as opinion, as more of a personal essay. Down here under key points, there's really no demonstration of this person's expertise beyond a mention of this course. And unfortunately, the article was already written and it was about 3,000 words, which is almost triple or pretty much triple our longest pieces. So there's sort of a bunch of red flags here. This pitch, another one that needs a lot of work. It's much more detailed. However, it talks about ranking. It says the ranking of people, schools, products, countries, and just about everything else is part of our daily life. Even though it offers a lot more information and context, it's still a really broad and general topic. It's not really a story yet. We weren't really sure what the story was after reading this pitch, what the proposed story was. He mentions under significance that everybody with whom he's talked to in the last several years has seemed to agree that the topic of ranking is hot. So, it's interesting, it's anecdotal, but there's no research mentioned. So again, we really don't know what the story is, and we don't know what the research is that it would be based upon. Down here under significance 2, we should learn how to navigate between objectivity and subjectivity. This really read like opinion to the editors, and again, it's just a little bit too broad. There's nothing really new or surprising or research-based here. And then lastly, another red flag in this one was at the very bottom, it says, in this article, I will reanalyze these stories he mentioned earlier in the pitch from the perspective of my recent book. That's just not really something we ever do in our model. If we've, decided to publish a piece, surely we will expand and further the discussion as new insight and research comes out and is published, but we don't really reanalyze stories that we've already published. It's just not part of our model. This was an interesting one that came in not too long ago. about it's titled The Passion of Britney Spears, from Southern Baptist to Kabbalah to possibly Catholicism. Britney Spears' religious life speaks to her struggles, her faith, and her fandom. It's written really clearly. It's compelling. However, there's no indication that this is at all research based. And as you go on and read a little bit more about the pitch, it just sort of further convinced the editor that this would be more of a personal essay and not something that was based in his research. He also mentions like a time peg that has passed. So he says something happened 2 weeks ago, which doesn't seem like a long time ago, but it's kind of like years ago in journalism. So not quite, but it's the time peg has definitely passed at that point. He mentions he's already written the piece. And he mentions this idea around covering the moral panic around her performative sexuality. But again, there's nothing substantive here that tells us, that this is based in research or what his findings would tell us. I think just in the interest of time, I'll skip ahead to my last slide. But if anyone has any questions, if you happen to look at the slides and want to ask me about them, please feel free. Just in conclusion, here are some reminders and best practices that I hope will be helpful. Like I mentioned before, always check our site to search the proposed topic before pitching. Not only is it an essential part of research to see if we've already published your story angle, but it's also a good way just to get a sense of the tone of our stories and other ways we've approached a particular topic. Also, as I mentioned before, reach out to BUPR and social media. We work with them very closely. They are experts in getting your work out there and can help you think about what you want to share and really the most effective way to share it. Thirdly, our pitch through our portal is really the best way to send us your story idea. Not emailing a written draft that is usually occasionally it can be successful. Usually it's not. Our process really works best when a scholar and an editor work on a story together from the very beginning of the process, which starts with the commissioning of a pitch. And lastly, if at first you don't succeed, try again. As one of our editors likes to say, a baseball player batting 300 is having a very good season. So practice really, really helps with the pitching process and understanding what news outlets are looking for. I will go ahead and stop sharing my slides. Thank you all so much for your time, for your interest, for being here today, and for your great questions. If anyone has any last questions in the remaining minutes, I would be more than happy to answer them.
Michelle, I can chime in with a question that's been asked in the chat. And then if anyone feels comfortable, you can unmute yourself or continue to ask in the chat. But this is a new question. The politics and society pitch is a good example of a place-based story. How do you prioritize or balance stories that are place-specific versus stories with wider geographic implications?
That is a really good question, and I'm so glad someone asked that. So really the key, and you can't quite see this in the pitch, but the story covered it. The key is really to be able to sort of zoom out and apply something that's happening, either a trend or whatever place-specific occurrence that is happening. It needs to be representative of something happening elsewhere. So if it's sort of, I had another pitch in there on the pitches that need improvement side that was Michigan specific, and it was not successful because it never really got to a place where it told us what the implications of this were or why it mattered for readers or residents, outside of this specific area of Michigan that the piece was talking about. So really, because we're a national audience, things need to be resonant and of interest to a general US reader. When we do talk about place-specific research or place-specific findings, it has to be representative of in some way of things that are happening elsewhere in the country. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for the question.
Michelle, one more question we saw in the chat. These are two similar. Someone asked, do Doctor of Public Health students qualify like PhD students? And someone else asked if doctoral students besides PhD candidates, are they eligible to write for the conversation?
Yes, I need to check specifically the eligibility. I think it remains the same. It's sort of the same as master's students, and that you can write about research that you are involved in. You would just need to have a faculty or research co-author.
Thanks for clarifying.
Oh, sure. I'm trying to scan the chat too. Molly, thanks so much for all your help with the questions.
Yeah, of course.
Well, I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes if anyone wanted to ask a question in a smaller venue, or if questions come up, later today, tomorrow, next week. I'm also happy to answer any questions you might have by email. I'll put my email in the chat now in case that's helpful. But thank you all so much for being here and letting me share a little bit about the conversation with you today. And thanks again to BU's Office of Research and PR and Social Media team. It's been a pleasure.